The wind in the Wyoming Territory did not blow so much as it scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 miles of badlands, stripping the paint from the siding of the false front buildings in Bitter Creek and embedding itself into the skin of anyone foolish enough to stop there. It was the late 1870s, and the town was already dying. The silver veins in the hills had thinned out, leaving behind a skeleton crew of prospectors, drunks, and those too poor to move on. Luke Travers felt the grit between his teeth as he rode his gelding down the main thoroughfare. He pulled the brim of his hat lower, shielding his eyes from the relentless glare of the midday sun. He was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the same sandstone as the surrounding cliffs. Hard, weathered, and enduring. His coat was dusted with the pale gray powder of the trail, and the Winchester in his saddle scabbard was not for show. He was looking for a ghost. Or rather, he was looking for the widow of a ghost. He reined in his horse outside the livery, dismounting with a stiffness that spoke of days in the saddle. He tied the animal to the rail and patted its neck absently, his eyes scanning the street. Bitter Creek was a place where hope went to suffocate. A dog slept in the shade of a water trough, too lethargic to bark. 2 men sat on the porch of the general store, whittling and watching him with a suspicion reserved for strangers who rode animals that looked well-fed. Luke pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. It was dark inside, smelling of stale beer and sawdust. He ordered a whiskey, sliding a silver coin across the scarred wood of the bar. The barkeep was a heavy man with a mustache that drooped past his chin. He poured the drink without asking questions. Luke took a sip. It was burned, harsh and cheap. "I'm looking for work," he said. His voice graveled from disuse. "Heard there might be a ranch south of town." The barkeep laughed, a short, dry sound. "Nobody's hiring in Bitter Creek, mister, unless you want to dig for silver that isn't there." "I work horses," Luke said. "Not rock." The man wiped a rag across the counter. "Horses. Well, the only one with horses worth a damn is the Monroe widow, but she cannot pay you." Luke kept his face impassive. "Monroe, that would be Thomas Monroe's widow." "That is the one. Clara. Poor woman holds on to that land like a drowning man holds a stone." The barkeep leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Bad luck in that place. Her husband died 5 years back. Border skirmish, they say, but nobody saw the body. Just came back in a box. Folks say the land is cursed by the blood money Thomas used to buy it." Luke stared into the amber liquid in his glass. He knew exactly where the money had come from. He knew exactly how Thomas Monroe had died. The memory of the ambush, the smoke, the screaming horses, the terrible mistake, flashed behind his eyes. He pushed it down. "Where is the place?" Luke asked. 5 miles south. Follow the creek bed until it runs dry. You will see the barn, big red thing, peeling paint. But do not say I did not warn you. Stranger, what is your name? Anyway." Luke downed the rest of the whiskey. He set the glass down with a heavy clink. "Caleb," he lied. "Caleb Frost. Clara Monroe was losing the war. It was not a war against men with guns. Not yet, but a war against the land itself. She stood in the center of the round pen, dust swirling around her heavy skirts. In front of her, a sorrel Mustang colt reared, striking out with its forelegs. The animal was terrified, its eyes rolling white, its coat matted with sweat and burrs. It had a gash on its flank, likely from a cougar or a barbed wire fence, and the wound was festering. "Easy," Clara said, her voice low and steady. She held her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am not going to hurt you." The colt snorted and backed away, slamming its hindquarters against the wooden rails of the pen. The wood creaked ominously. Clara wiped a strand of dark hair from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. She was exhausted. The bank had sent another letter, threatening foreclosure if she did not make a payment by the 1st of the month. The herd was thinning. The fence line was down in 3 places, and she was alone. She had been alone for 5 years. Ever since Thomas died, the townspeople avoided her, whispering that she was a black widow. that the violence Thomas had lived by had come home to roost. They said she was proud, stuck up. They did not see the nights she spent counting pennies by the light of a single tallow candle. They did not see the blisters on her hands or the rifle she slept with under her pillow. The colt lunged again, snapping its teeth. Clara stepped back quickly, stumbling over a root. She caught herself, but the moment of weakness emboldened the horse. It charged. Clara raised her arms, shouting, "Back! Get back!" The colt veered at the last second, its hoof grazing her shoulder, the force of the air knocking the breath from her lungs. She fell back against the fence, gasping, "You are going to get yourself killed. Doing it like that." The voice came from the gate. It was deep, calm, and utterly unfamiliar. Clara spun around, her hand instinctively going to the knife she kept in her belt. A man stood leaning against the rails. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a trail-worn duster and a hat that shadowed his face. He looked dangerous, in the way a loaded weapon sitting on a table looked dangerous. Quiet, but capable of sudden violence. "Who are you?" she demanded, straightening her spine. She refused to look afraid. "My name is Caleb," the man said. He did not move to enter the pen. He just watched the horse. "That animal is in pain. He thinks you are the one causing it. I am trying to clean the wound," Clara snapped. "And you are trespassing." "I am looking for work," he said, ignoring her accusation. He climbed over the rail with an easy, fluid grace that belied his size. He moved differently than the town men, economical, precise. He did not waste energy. "I have no money for hired hands," Clara said, stepping between him and the horse. "You are wasting your time. Move on." The man stopped 10 feet from the colt. He did not look at Clara. He kept his eyes on the animal. He lowered his head slightly, making himself smaller, less threatening. He began to hum, a low, tuneless sound that vibrated in the hot afternoon air. The colt's ears twitched. It stopped pacing. "I do not need money," the man said softly, still watching the horse. "I need a place to sleep and a meal a day. I am headed west, but my horse threw a shoe and I'm short on supplies. I will give you a week of labor for a roof and a full belly." Clara hesitated. Every instinct she had screamed at her to send him away. A drifter, riding in out of nowhere, offering to work for scraps. It was suspicious. But she looked at the colt, shivering and hurt. She looked at the sagging barn roof she could not fix herself. She looked at the empty horizon. "If you touch me," Clara said, her voice steady, "I will shoot you. If you steal from me, I will shoot you. If you are lazy, I will shoot you." The man turned to look at her then. His eyes were a startling, pale blue, contrasting sharply with his tanned, stubbled face. There was no mockery in them, only a weary sort of understanding. "Understood, ma'am," he said. He turned back to the horse. He moved forward, slow as a shadow lengthening at dusk. The colt trembled but did not run. The man reached out a hand, letting the animal smell his scent. Leather, tobacco, and dust. "Easy, son," he murmured. "Let's get that leg fixed up." Clara watched, her arms crossed over her chest, as the stranger calmed the beast that had nearly trampled her moments before. She felt a strange tightening in her chest, a mixture of relief and a new, sharper kind of anxiety. She had invited a wolf into her fold because she could not fight the bears alone. The first 3 days were an exercise in silence. Luke, who she knew as Caleb, worked from before dawn until after sunset. He repaired the corral fence, replacing the rotted posts with new cedar he cut from the ridge. He reshod her mare. He cleaned the infection in the Mustang's flank with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his scarred knuckles. Clara watched him from the kitchen window. She watched the way his muscles bunched beneath his shirt when he swung a hammer. She watched the way he wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. "Fence is fixed. Mare needs grain." A storm is coming. They ate dinner at the small pine table in her kitchen. The silence between them was thick, filled with the sounds of cutlery scraping against tin plates. Clara found herself studying him when he was not looking. He ate quickly, like a man used to having his meals interrupted. He never sat with his back to the door. "Where are you from, Caleb?" she asked on the fourth evening. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window panes. He paused, a piece of cornbread halfway to his mouth. "Texas," he said. "Texas is a big place. Big enough to get lost in," he replied. He did not elaborate. "Why leave? Why stay?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Why do you stay here, Mrs. Monroe? The town says this land is dead. They say you should sell." Clara stiffened. "The town talks too much. This is my home. It was my husband's dream. Was it yours?" The question caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands. A wife's dream is her husband's dream. "That is the way of things." "That is a lie people tell to keep women quiet," Luke said. His voice was not unkind, just flatly honest. Clara flushed. "You are bold for a drifter living in my barn." "I am just observing." Luke pushed his plate away. "Your husband, Thomas, he was a cattleman?" "He was a businessman," Clara said. "He wanted to build a legacy here. He bought this land right after the war. He had big plans." "Plans take money," Luke said. "And money usually takes blood. Out here." Clara's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by that?" Luke shrugged. "Just that nothing in this territory comes free. You pay for it one way or another." Clara stood up, collecting the plates with a clatter. "My husband was a good man. He died defending this territory. Is that right?" Luke watched her. His expression was unreadable. "How did he die?" "He was ambushed," Clara said, her back to him as she pumped water into the basin. "South of the border, a group of bandits. They said it was over a land dispute, but it was just murder. Plain and simple." Luke looked at her rigid back. He could see the tension in her shoulders. He wanted to tell her the truth then. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't bandits, that it was a hired group of regulators, men paid to clear the valley for the railroad, and that he had been one of them. He wanted to tell her that Thomas Monroe hadn't been a hero. He had been a speculator playing both sides of a range war, and his luck had run out. But he looked at the line of her neck, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide, and the words died in his throat. "I am sorry for your loss," he said instead. "I do not need your pity," Clara said sharply. She turned around, drying her hands on a rag. "I need the south pasture cleared of sagebrush tomorrow. If you are done eating, you can go." Luke stood up. He nodded once, put his hat on, and walked out into the night. The environment of the Wyoming Territory was not merely a setting. It was an adversary. The sun bleached the color from everything. The grass was a pale, brittle yellow. The earth a cracked mosaic of tan and gray. The only vibrant things were the sunsets, which bruised the sky in violent shades of purple and crimson, and the blood that occasionally spilled on the dry ground. The harshness of the land reflected the hardened inner lives of the two people living on the ranch. Clara had become like the sagebrush, deep-rooted, tough, bitter to the taste, surviving on almost nothing. She had learned to hoard her emotions like water. Luke was like the basalt rocks on the ridge, jagged, dark, formed by fire and pressure. He existed in a state of constant vigilance. He slept lightly, his hand always near the Colt peacemaker he kept wrapped in oilcloth. A week turned into 2. Clara could not afford to pay him, but she cooked him hearty meals and mended his torn shirt. They developed a rhythm. She would come out to the barn in the mornings to find the horses already fed and watered. He would come in at dusk to find a hot stew waiting. The wariness remained, but curiosity began to chip away at the edges. Clara watched him gentle a wild mare, his hands moving with a patience that mesmerized her. She saw him stop to watch a hawk circling overhead, a look of profound sadness on his face. He was a puzzle she could not solve. He was educated, she could tell by his vocabulary. Though he tried to hide it, he moved like a soldier. He knew horses better than any ranch hand she had ever met, and he was hiding something. One evening, the heat broke with a sudden, violent thunderstorm. Rain hammered against the roof of the barn. turning the dust of the corral into slick mud. Luke had been working on the irrigation ditch all day, digging through the hard-panned clay. Clara ran from the house to the barn, holding a shawl over her head, intending to check on the foal that had been born 2 days prior. She pushed open the heavy barn door and slipped inside, shaking the water from her skirts. The barn was warm and smelled of sweet hay and wet wool. A single lantern hung from a nail on the center post, casting a circle of golden light. Clara stopped dead. Luke was standing by the water trough. He had stripped off his shirt to wash the mud from his body. He was facing away from her, bending over the water, unaware of her presence. Clara's breath caught in her throat. His back was a landscape of violence. Thick, ropey scars crisscrossed his skin. Some were the pale, shiny tracks of a whip. Others were the jagged, puckered marks of bullet wounds that had healed poorly. There was a long, slash-like scar running from his right shoulder blade down to his ribs, as if someone had tried to carve him open with a saber. It was a map of pain. It was a history of survival written in flesh. Clara should have turned away. Decency demanded it, but she could not move. She stared at the muscles shifting beneath the ruined skin as he scrubbed his face. She felt a strange, hollow ache in her stomach. She wondered who had hurt him. She wondered who had stitched him back together. She took a step backward, and her boot heel crunched on a piece of dry straw. Luke spun around. The movement was instantaneous. In a heartbeat, he had a knife in his hand. She hadn't even seen where he pulled it from, and he was crouched in a defensive stance, his eyes wild and lethal. Clara gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Recognition flooded Luke's eyes. He straightened slowly, but he did not lower the knife immediately. His chest was heaving. The water dripped from his hair onto his shoulders, tracing the paths of the scars. I did not mean to startle you," Clara stammered. Her heart was racing so fast she thought she might faint. "I came to check on the foal." Luke lowered the knife. He reached for his shirt, which was draped over a stall door, and pulled it on quickly, his movements jerky. He did not button it. "You should knock," he said, his voice rough. "It is my barn," Clara retorted, though her voice lacked its usual fire. She could not look away from his chest, glimpsing the dark hair and the smooth skin that had been hidden. "You saw," he said. It wasn't a question. "I saw." Clara took a step closer, compelled by a force she didn't understand. "Who did that to you? Caleb?" "Life," he said grimly. "War, bad men, good men who thought they were doing right." He buttoned the shirt, hiding the history. "Does it disgust you?" Clara looked at him. She saw the shame in his eyes, deep and buried. She thought of her own scars, the ones that didn't show on her skin, the memory of Thomas's cold hands, the silence of the empty house, the fear that woke her at 3 a.m. "No," she whispered. "It does not disgust me." The air between them shifted. It became heavy, charged with the storm outside and the heat of the bodies inside. They stood 5 feet apart, but it felt like inches. Clara could smell the rain on him, the soap, the scent of a man. She felt a sudden, terrifying urge to cross the distance and touch him, to see if he was real. Luke stared at her. His eyes dropped to her lips, then snapped back up to her eyes. He took a step back, retreating into the shadows. "Check the foe," he said, his voice tight. "I am going up to the loft." He turned and climbed the ladder without looking back. Clara stood in the lantern light, shivering, though the barn was warm. Sleep did not come easily to Luke that night. The image of Clara standing in the barn, her dark hair damp from the rain, her eyes wide with shock and something else, something soft, burned in his mind. He lay on his bedroll in the hayloft, listening to the rain drum against the shingles. He was a liar. He was a fraud. Every day he stayed here, every fence post he fixed, he was deceiving her. He was the man who had pulled the trigger. It had been chaos, dust, and confusion, but the bullet had been his. He had seen Thomas Monroe fall. He had seen the locket fly from his neck. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out. The canyon walls are closing in. The sun is blinding. The horses are screaming. He raises the rifle. The man on the bay horse turns. He has a mustache and terrified eyes. Luke pulls the trigger. The recoil hits his shoulder. The man falls backwards. The blood hits the dust. Red on gray. Red on gray. No! Luke woke with a shout, his body jerking upright. He was drenched in cold sweat. His hand was already gripping the revolver beside his pillow. The barn was silent, save for the soft nickering of a horse below. The rain had stopped. He sat there, breathing hard, the metallic taste of adrenaline in his mouth. He holstered the gun with a shaking hand and buried his face in his palms. "Caleb?" The voice came from the ladder. Luke froze. He looked up to see Clara's head and shoulders appearing above the loft floor. She was holding the lantern again. She was wearing a white nightgown with a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was loose, falling down her back in a dark cascade. "I heard you yell," she said softly. She climbed the rest of the way up, setting the lantern on a crate. "Go away," Luke croaked. "It was just a dream." "It sounded like more than a dream," Clara said. She did not leave. She walked over to him and knelt in the hay. She placed a bottle of whiskey on the floor between them. "I brought this. Thomas used to drink it when the memories of the war got too loud." Luke looked at the bottle, then at her, in the soft light. She looked younger, softer. The harsh lines of the day were smoothed out. "I do not want your charity," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It is not charity, it is medicine." She uncorked the bottle and took a swig herself, wincing as it went down. She handed it to him. Luke took it. Their fingers brushed against the glass. Her skin was warm, rough from work, but undeniably feminine. The contact sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the nightmare. He held her gaze for a long moment, seeing the loneliness mirrored in her eyes. He drank. The whiskey burned away the lingering taste of the dream. "What do you dream about?" Clara asked quietly. "Things that cannot be undone," Luke said. He handed the bottle back. "We all have those," she said. She sat back on her heels, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sometimes I dream that the house is burning. I'm standing outside, watching it burn, and I do not move to put it out. I just watched." "That does not make you a bad person," Luke said. "Doesn't it?" She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "I did not love him, Caleb, not the way a wife should. He was hard, and now he is dead. And I am alone, and I am afraid I am relieved." It was a confession she had never spoken aloud. The silence that followed was profound. Luke looked at this woman, this fierce, broken creature who was fighting a losing battle for a ghost she didn't even love. He felt a crack in the armor he had worn for 5 years. He wanted to comfort her. He wanted to tell her that she was not the sinner here. He reached out, almost involuntarily, and covered her hand with his. His hand was large, swallowing hers. Clara went still. She looked down at their hands, then up at his face. She did not pull away. She leaned forward slightly, drawn by the gravity between them. "You are not a simple drifter, Caleb Frost," she whispered. "No," he said hoarsely. "I am not. You move like a soldier. You wake up screaming like a man haunted." She searched his eyes, looking for the truth he kept hidden behind the blue ice. Her gaze was penetrating, stripping away the layers of lies he had wrapped around himself. "You have killed before, haven't you?" The question hung in the air, sharp and absolute. Luke looked at her. He could lie. He could say it was the war. He could say it was self-defense. He could make up a story about defending a wagon train or fighting Indians. But looking at her face, illuminated by the flickering lantern, he could not bring himself to speak another falsehood. Not right now. He tightened his grip on her hand for a brief second, then slowly pulled away. He picked up the whiskey bottle and took another long drink, staring into the shadows of the loft rafters. He did not answer her. The silence stretched, filling the space between them with spoken and unspoken truths. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the barn mont walls, the arrangement regarding the loft became an unspoken law between them. Luke Travers, who still answered to the name Caleb Frost, slept above the horses, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of dust and sweet hay. Clara Monroe slept in the main house, in the marital bed that felt too large for one woman, with a loaded Colt Navy revolver beneath her pillow. Every night. She checked the percussion caps. Every night. She locked the heavy oak door and slid the iron bolt home. It was a ritual born of necessity, not paranoia. In the Wyoming Territory, a woman alone was prey, and a woman alone with a strange man in her barn was walking a razor's edge. Yet, as the days bled into a second week, the lock on the door began to feel less like a barrier against Luke and more like a habit she could not quite break. She would wake before dawn, the sky a bruised purple in the east, and see the faint glow of a lantern in the barn window. He was always up before her. By the time she walked out with the milk pail, the horses were fed, the stalls were mucked, and the scent of brewing coffee, strong and black, made over a small fire he built near the tack room, drifted on the chill morning air. They moved around each other like two planets in uncertain orbit, held together by the gravity of the work that needed doing. One Tuesday morning, Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching Luke break ice on the water trough. The sight of him, his breath plumbing in the cold air, the easy strength with which he wielded the heavy iron pry bar, triggered a memory so sharp it nearly doubled her over. It was not a memory of Luke. It was a memory of Thomas. The flashback hit her with the force of a physical blow. 5 years ago, the parlor of this very house, though the furniture had been newer then. Thomas Monroe had stood by the fireplace, his face flushed with drink, holding a piece of paper that shook in his hand. "It is an investment. Clara!" Thomas had shouted, his voice slurring. "A sure thing. The railroad is coming south. We just need the capital to buy the rights to the water." Clara had sat in the high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from trembling. She was 22 years old, 3 months married, and she had already learned that her husband was a man built of hollow promises. "We have no capital. Thomas, you lost the cattle money at the tables in Cheyenne." The silence that followed had been terrifying. Thomas had crossed the room in 3 strides. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into the tender flesh until she gasped. "Do not speak to me about money, woman. Your father sold you to me to settle his own debts. You are nothing but another ledger entry." He had shoved her back against the chair. She had not cried. She had learned early that tears only fueled his contempt. She had simply watched him storm out, leaving her to nurse her bruising wrist and the dawning realization that her life was now a cage. When they brought his body home 2 years later, sealed in a pine box because of the desert heat and the coyotes had not been kind to it, she had stood by the open grave in the driving rain. The preacher had spoken of Thomas's bravery, of his tragic end in a border skirmish defending American interests. Clara had stared at the wet earth piling up on the coffin. She had searched her heart for grief, for anger, for love. She found only a vast, terrifying relief. She buried him without a single tear. Clara blinked, the kitchen coming back into focus. The memory receded, leaving a cold sweat on her spine. Out by the trough, Luke looked up as if he felt her gaze. He touched the brim of his hat, a small, respectful gesture. Clara touched her own wrist, feeling the ghost of a bruise that had faded years ago. She turned from the window, grabbed her coat, and went out to meet the day. The corral fence on the south side had been leaning dangerously for months. The cedar posts rotted at the base by winter snowmelt. It was a 2-person job, one that Clara had put off because she had no one to hold the posts while she tamped the earth. "Grab the shovel," Luke said, tossing the tool toward her. He did not ask if she could handle it. He simply assumed she could. They worked in the steady rhythm of people who knew the language of work. Luke used the post hole digger, slamming the blades into the unforgiving hardpan, while Clara cleared the loose dirt and set the new posts. The sun beat down on them, turning the air shimmering and hot. "Hold it steady," Luke grunted, his shoulder pressing against hers as he maneuvered a heavy rail into place. Clara braced herself, the rough bark of the wood biting into her gloves. She could smell him, the scent of sweat, leather, and the faint, metallic tang of gun oil. It was a masculine scent, overwhelming in its proximity. His arm brushed against hers, hard muscle against her own hidden strength. "You swing a hammer better than most men I have known," Luke noted, driving a nail home with 2 precise strikes. "Most men I have known talk more than they work," Clara shot back, wiping dirt from her cheek with her shoulder. "I had to learn to do it myself, or the roof would have come down on my head." Luke paused, resting the hammer on his thigh. He looked at her, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. It was the first time she had seen something approaching a genuine smile on his face. "I suppose that is true. Though I have known a few men who could work a shovel and talk a hole through a limestone cliff at the same time. Were they friends of yours?" The smile faded, replaced by that familiar, guarded mask. "Men I rode with once." "And where are they now?" "Dead," Luke said flatly. "Or wishing they were." He turned back to the fence, effectively ending the conversation. But the moment lingered. They worked side by side as the sun climbed higher. Clara found herself stealing glances at him when his back was turned. She watched the way his shirt clung to his back, damp with exertion. She watched the focused intensity of his profile. There was a danger in him. Yes, she had seen the scars. She had seen the way his hand hovered near his hip whenever a hawk screeched or a shadow moved, but there was also a steadiness she had never known. Thomas had been chaotic, a storm of impulses. Luke was a rock. Around noon, they took a break, sitting in the shade of the barn with canteens of tepid water. "The Bay Mary is favoring her left foreleg," Luke said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "She stepped in a gopher hole last week," Clara replied. "I put a poultice on it, but she is stubborn." "So, like her mistress," Luke murmured into his canteen. Clara shot him a look, but there was no heat in it. "Survival requires stubbornness. Mr. Frost, if I were pliable, this ranch would be sagebrush and dust by now." "It is mostly sagebrush and dust anyway," Luke countered dryly. "It is my sagebrush and dust." They looked at each other. For a second, the air between them hummed with a strange electricity. It was not just attraction, though that was there, simmering under the surface like magma. It was recognition. 2 wounded animals circling each other, sniffing for threats, finding kinship instead. Luke looked away first, clearing his throat. "We should finish the north section before the light goes." Clara nodded, but her heart was beating a strange, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The trouble arrived on Thursday, in the form of a peddler's wagon rattling down the valley road. Silas Finch was a man who sold pots, pans, patent medicines, and gossip, usually in that order. He pulled his mule team up to the front porch, the wagon groaning under the weight of his wares. Clara went out to meet him, wiping flour from her hands. Luke stayed back by the barn, pretending to sharpen a scythe, but Clara saw him tilt his head, listening. "Afternoon, Widow Monroe," Silas called out, climbing down from the seat with a grunt. "Hot enough to melt the devil's own spurs today. Good afternoon. Silas, I do not need any pots today." "Oh, I ain't just selling pots. Got a new tonic for rheumatism. And I got news from Laramie." Silas leaned against his wagon wheel, eager to spill his information. "Big stir over in the county seat. Some regulators passed through. Mean-looking bunch. Working for the Cattle Association. Or maybe the railroad. Nobody knows for sure." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "Regulators?" "Aye, looking for a man. They say he killed a Pinkerton agent down in Colorado. Or maybe a sheriff in Texas. Stories vary. But the description is clear enough. Tall fella, dark hair. Got a back carved up like a Sunday roast, if you will pardon the expression." Clara's breath hitched. She did not look toward the barn. She kept her eyes fixed on Silas's face. "Did they say his name?" "No name, just a description. They are offering $500 for him, dead or alive, though they seem to prefer death." Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "You have not seen any strangers about, have you, Clara? A woman alone out here. You cannot be too careful." "No," Clara lied, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "I have seen no one, just the wind and the coyotes." Silas nodded, disappointed. He sold her a small bag of sugar she could barely afford, just to keep up appearances, and rattled off down the road. As soon as the wagon disappeared over the rise, Clara turned and marched to the barn. Luke was standing in the shadows of the doorway, the scythe still in his hand. His face was hard, his eyes cold. "You heard him," Clara said. "I heard him. Are they looking for you, Caleb?" She used the false name like a weapon. Luke looked at her. He did not flinch. "There are 100 men in this territory with scars and a price on their head. The war made us all. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have." He turned and walked back into the dark of the barn, leaving her standing in the blinding sunlight, her heart twisting with fear and a terrible, sinking suspicion. The tension in the house was thick enough to choke on for the next 2 days. Clara slept with her hand on the revolver. Luke worked with a frenetic energy, as if he could outrun his past by fixing every broken hinge and fence post on the property. On Saturday, the windmill at the north section of the property stopped turning. The water tank was dry, and the cattle were bawling. "I will ride out and fix it," Luke said at breakfast. "I am coming with you," Clara said. She did not trust him to come back, or perhaps she did not trust him not to run. They rode out together, the silence between them heavy. The north pasture was the most desolate part of the ranch, a landscape of scrub brush and red rock canyons. The windmill stood like a skeleton against the sky, its blades rusted and still. They dismounted. Luke climbed the tower to grease the gears, while Clara checked the trough and the float valve. "The rod is bent," Luke called down, his voice carried away by the wind. "I need to hammer it out." Clara watched him work, silhouetted against the sun. He was capable, strong. He was a liar. The two truths warred in her mind. Suddenly, her horse, a skittish roan gelding, shied violently. A rattlesnake, coiled in the shade of a sagebrush, buzzed its warning. Clara, caught off guard, grabbed for the reins, but the horse reared, twisting in the air. The heavy leather stirrup slammed into her side, and she was thrown backward. She hit the edge of the dry ditch with a sickening thud. The world went white, then gray. Pain exploded in her hip and ankle. She rolled to the bottom of the ditch, gasping for air, dust filling her mouth. "Clara!" The shout was raw, terrified. She heard the sound of boots hitting the ground, slipping on loose rock. Then hands were on her, frantic, searching. "Do not move," Luke commanded. He was kneeling beside her in the dirt, his face pale beneath the tan. "Tell me where it hurts." "My ankle," Clara gasped, trying to sit up. "And my hip." Luke's hands moved over her legs, gentle but firm. He checked for breaks. "Nothing is broken, just a bad sprain and some bruising. You are lucky." "I do not feel lucky." She groaned. She tried to stand, but her leg buckled. Luke caught her. Without a word, he swept her up into his arms. "Put me down," Clara protested weakly. "I can walk." "You cannot walk, and we are 5 miles from the house." Luke adjusted his grip, holding her high against his chest. He began to climb out of the ditch. He was incredibly strong. He carried her as if she weighed nothing. Clara's head rested against his shoulder. She could feel the heat of his body through his shirt. She could smell the sweat and the grease from the windmill. His heart was hammering against her ear, a fast, hard rhythm. He carried her to his horse, the steadier of the two animals. He lifted her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist to hold the reins. The ride back was an agony and a revelation. Every step of the horse jarred Clara's injured hip, but Luke held her tight, his body acting as a buffer. Her back was pressed against his chest. She could feel every breath he took, her own breath hitched, warm against the hollow of his neck. She should have been afraid. She was injured, helpless, in the arms of a man who was likely a killer. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of crimson, she felt safe. It was a treacherous, confusing safety. "You are trembling," Luke murmured, his mouth close to her ear. "It is the cold," she lied. His arms tightened around her, just a fraction. "We are almost home." By the time they reached the ranch, night had fallen. A storm was brewing in the west, heavy black clouds swallowing the stars. The air was thick with a scent of ozone and impending rain. Luke helped her down from the horse and practically carried her into the house. He set her on the settee in the parlor. "I will put the horses up," he said. "Then I will come back and check that ankle." "No," Clara said. She was in pain, but the adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a sharp, crystal clarity. The intimacy of the ride, the feel of his arms, the rumors from town, it all collided in her chest. "We are done pretending, Caleb, or whatever your name is." Luke stopped at the door. He did not turn around. "Go put the horses up," she said, her voice trembling. "Then come to the barn. We're going to talk." 20 minutes later, Clara limped into the barn. She had wrapped her ankle tight, ignoring the throbbing ache. The wind was howling now, rattling the barn doors on their hinges. Thunder rumbled low and menacing in the distance. Luke was standing by the tack room, cleaning a bridle. He looked up as she entered. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. "You should be resting," he said. "Stop it," Clara snapped. She moved toward him, favoring her good leg. "Stop playing the concerned ranch hand. Stop playing the hero." Luke set the bridle down. "I never claimed to be a hero." "Clara." "No, you just claimed to be Caleb Frost, a drifter from Texas." She stopped 3 feet from him, her eyes blazing. "But Silas said the regulators are looking for a man with a scarred back. A man who kills. Is that you? Did you kill that agent? Did you kill my husband?" The accusation hung in the air. Luke's face went rigid. "I did not kill the agent." "But you killed someone." "I have killed many men," Luke said, his voice dropping to a growl. "That is what happens in war. That is what happens when you live the life I have lived." "And Thomas?" Clara demanded. "Did you know him?" "I knew of him." "Liar!" Clara screamed. The word tore out of her throat. She stepped forward and slapped him. It was a solid blow. Her palm cracked against his cheek, stinging with the force of it. Luke did not recoil. He did not flinch. Instead, the impact seemed to snap something inside him. In a blur of motion, he reached out and grabbed her shoulders. He spun her around and pinned her against the rough wood of the stall wall. It was not an act of violence, but an act of desperation. His body pressed against hers, pinning her there, trapping her. "You want the truth?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. His eyes were dark, dilated, burning with a fire she had never seen. "The truth is ugly. Clara, the truth will destroy you." "I do not care," Clara shouted back. Though her voice shook, she could feel the hard lines of his body against hers, his chest, his hips, the sheer, overwhelming reality of him. "I am tired of lies. I am tired of being alone in the dark." Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the barn foundation. The rain began to hammer against the roof, a deafening roar. Luke stared at her. He looked at her mouth, her flushed cheeks, her eyes wide with fear and fury and desire. "I am a liar," he rasped. "I am a wanted man. I am poison to everything I touch." "Then poison me," Clara whispered. She did not know where the words came from. They bypassed her brain and came straight from the lonely, starving center of her soul. Luke let out a sound that was half groan, half curse. He crashed his mouth down on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was rough, desperate, consuming. It tasted of salt and whiskey and rain. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back, deepening the kiss until she could not breathe, until she did not want to breathe. Clara's hands bunched in his shirt, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his own. All the years of silence, of endurance, of cold, polite touches from a husband she despised. They all burned away in the heat of this man's mouth. She moaned into his mouth, her body arching against him. "You're a liar, but I still want you." Luke froze. The words seemed to pierce the haze of passion. He pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. His hands were still gripping her arms, his thumbs digging into her skin. He pressed his body against hers one last time, a silent testament to how much he wanted to take her, right there in the straw. The evidence of his desire was hard against her stomach, but he did not. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw working. "No," he whispered. "Not like this. Not with a lie between us." He released her abruptly, stepping back as if he had been burned. Clara slumped against the wall, her lips swollen, her heart hammering a frantic tattoo against her ribs. The rain pounded on the roof. The barn was filled with the sound of their ragged breathing. Luke looked at her one last time, a look of profound longing and profound regret. Then he turned and walked into the darkness of the tack room, leaving Clara alone in the lantern light, shaking, aching, and more terrified than she had ever been in her life. The morning after the storm, the air in Bitter Creek felt scrubbed clean, but the silence between Clara Monroe and Luke Travers was heavier than the mud that clogged the ranch yard. They moved around each other like ghosts in a house too small for the living, avoiding eye contact, their bodies humming with the memory of the kiss that had almost happened, and the one that had. Luke threw himself into work with a terrifying intensity. He spent 3 days digging a new drainage ditch along the south pasture, swinging the pickaxe until his hands were raw and blistered. He did not wear gloves. He seemed to want the pain, a physical distraction from the ache in his chest. Clara watched him from the porch, her coffee cup warm in her hands. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to saddle her mare, ride into town, and tell the marshal that a killer was sleeping in her barn. But then she would remember the way his body had trembled against hers, the desperate heat of his mouth, and the look of utter ruin in his eyes when he pulled away. He was a liar. That much was true, but he was also the man who had carried her 5 miles when she was hurt. He was the man who woke up screaming from nightmares she suspected were made of guilt. On the 4th evening, the silence finally broke. They were in the kitchen. Clara was mending a tear in his canvas coat while he oiled his boots by the stove. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room until Luke spoke. "I was in Lincoln County," he said. He did not look up from his boot. "Before I came north, I rode for the Cattlemen's Association." Clara stopped stitching. The needle hovered over the heavy fabric. Lincoln County was synonymous with blood. It was a place where the law was bought and sold, and men died for the crime of owning the wrong patch of grass. "Is that why they are looking for you?" she asked quietly. "Part of it," Luke said. He picked up a rag and rubbed the leather until it shone. "We were hired to keep order. That is what they told us. But order just meant clearing out the small outfits so the big barons could run their herds from the Pecos to the Rio Grande. We burned cabins. We cut fences. We killed men who refused to sell." "And you did those things?" Luke stopped rubbing. He looked at the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. "I did. I followed orders. I told myself it was war, and in war, you do what you have to do to survive. But it wasn't war. Clara, it was a slaughter." "And Thomas?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Was he part of that war?" Luke's jaw tightened. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of something she could not read. Shame, perhaps, or fear. The land wars touched everyone. "Clara, from Texas to Montana, your husband was a man who took risks. Men who take risks often find themselves on the wrong side of a rifle." It was an evasion. Clara knew it, but it was also the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 5 years. Thomas had been painted as a martyr by the town, a hero who died defending the border. Luke was painting him as a casualty of greed, which sounded far more like the husband she remembered. "I do not trust you, Caleb," she said, using the name she knew was false. "I do not know who you really are." Luke finally looked at her. His gaze was steady, stripped of the defenses he usually wore. He looked at her not as a widow, or a creditor, or a conquest, but as a woman who had survived the same fire that had burned him. "I know," he said, "but I am here, and as long as I am here, no one will hurt you. Not the bank, not the sheriff, not the ghosts." Clara looked down at the coat in her lap. She did not trust his words. But she trusted the way he looked at her, like she was the only solid thing in a world turning to ash. She hadn't felt that in years. She hadn't realized how much she was starving for it until now. 2 days later, the sorrel colt, the one Luke had gentled on his first day, took sick. It started with a cough, dry and hacking, and by noon the animal was sweating and shivering, its legs buckling under its own weight. Luke recognized the signs of strangles immediately. He isolated the colt in the far stall, packing the bedding with fresh straw and setting up a kettle of steaming water laced with eucalyptus oil to help the animal breathe. They worked through the night. Clara held the lantern while Luke forced a warm mash down the colt's throat. They sponged the animal's fevered neck with cool water. The barn was cold, the air smelling of sickness and damp hay, but neither of them complained. Around 3 a.m, the colt's breathing eased. It drank a bucket of water and lay down, exhausted but no longer thrashing. Clara slumped against the stall door, sliding down until she sat in the straw. She was exhausted. Her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in messy waves around her face. Her dress was stained with bran mash and mud. Luke sat opposite her, leaning against the manger. He looked as tired as she felt. He took a flask from his pocket, took a sip, and handed it to her. "He will live," Luke said. Clara took the flask. The whiskey was warm and sharp. "You have a gift with them," she said. "I would have lost him." "Horses are easy," Luke said. "They do not lie. They do not hold grudges. If they trust you, it is because you earned it." "Is that why you prefer them to people?" Luke smiled, a tired, crooked lifting of one corner of his mouth. "People are complicated. They say one thing and mean another. They hurt you because they are hurting." He reached out. It was a slow, deliberate movement. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against the curve of her jaw. His skin was rough, calloused from the pickaxe, but his touch was incredibly gentle. Clara stopped breathing. She should have pulled away. She should have remembered the gun under her pillow and the lies between them, but she didn't. She leaned into his hand, just a fraction of an inch. "You matter, Clara," Luke whispered. His voice was rough with fatigue. "You are the strongest thing I have ever seen. Do not let this town break you." Clara closed her eyes. Tears pricked at the corners, hot and sudden. She had spent 5 years being the widow Monroe, the object of pity or suspicion. She had forgotten what it felt like to be Clara. "I am tired of being strong," she admitted, the words falling into the space between them like stones. "Then rest," Luke said. He dropped his hand, breaking the contact, but the warmth remained. "I will watch the colt. Go to sleep." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, stood up on shaking legs, and walked back to the house. She slept without the gun under her pillow for the first time since Luke arrived. The piece was a fragile thing, made of glass, and it shattered on a Tuesday. Weevils had gotten into the flour barrel, and they were out of coffee. It was a mundane necessity that forced Luke into town. Clara offered to go, but her ankle was still tender, and Luke insisted. He saddled the bay gelding, pulling his hat low and checking the load in his revolver before sliding it into the holster. "I will be back before sundown," he promised. Clara watched him ride out, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She tried to occupy herself with churning butter, but the rhythm of the dasher felt like a countdown. By noon, the silence of the ranch was unbearable. She saddled the mare, ignoring the twinge in her ankle, and followed him. Bitter Creek was quiet when she arrived. The wind kicked up dust devils in the street, and the few horses tied at the hitching rails stood with their heads down. Clara saw the bay gelding tied outside the mercantile. She breathed a sigh of relief. He was just buying supplies. She tied her mare next to his and went inside. The shopkeeper, a sour-faced man named Higgins, told her that Caleb had already left, heading toward the saloon to buy a bottle of liniment from the bartender, who doubled as the town's apothecary. Clara walked toward the saloon. The sound of raised voices reached her before she even stepped onto the boardwalk. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and tension. Luke stood at the bar, his back to the room, his posture rigid. A few feet away, a man in a long, dusty duster sat at a table. He was a stranger, with the lean, predatory look of a wolf who had scented blood, a bounty hunter. "I know that walk," the stranger said. His voice was loud, carrying to every corner of the room. "I saw it in Abilene. I saw it in Hayes City. You walk like a man who is waiting for a bullet." Luke did not turn. "You have me confused with someone else." "Friend, I am just passing through." "Is that right?" The stranger stood up. His hand hovered near the dual Schofields at his hips. "You look a hell of a lot like the man who rode with the regulators down in Lincoln. The man they call Travers. The man who put a hole in a sheriff in El Paso?" The name hung in the air. "Travers?" Clara froze just outside the swinging doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Travers. Not Frost." "I go by Frost," Luke said, his voice deadly calm. "You can go by the King of England for all I care." The bounty hunter sneered. "The price on your head reads Luke Travers. $500. Dead or alive." He took a step closer. "And I hear you are working for the widow out at the old Monroe place. Pretty woman. I wonder if she knows she is sleeping with the man who—" The movement was so fast that Clara barely saw it. Luke spun around. The bounty hunter went for his gun, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. Luke's peacemaker cleared leather with a smooth, practiced fluidity. Crack. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The bounty hunter jerked backward as if kicked by a mule. A red flower bloomed in the center of his chest. He crumbled to the floor, his gun clattering uselessly across the wood planks. He gurgled once, trying to speak, trying to say the words that would damn Luke forever, but only blood bubbled past his lips. Silence descended on the saloon. The bartender stood with his hands in the air. The few patrons were pressed against the back wall. Luke stood over the body, his gun still smoking in his hand. He did not look triumphant. He looked sick. He looked like a man who had just shoveled more dirt onto his own grave. "He drew first," Luke said to the room. It was a statement of fact, not a plea for forgiveness. He holstered his gun and turned to leave. That was when he saw Clara. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale as milk, her eyes wide with horror. She looked from the dead man on the floor to Luke. She saw the gun on his hip. She saw the ease with which he had used it. "Clara," Luke said. The name came out sounding like a prayer. She did not speak. She backed away, stumbling slightly, then turned and ran toward her horse. Luke caught up to her 3 miles outside of town, near the ridge where the land dropped away into the canyon. He rode the bay hard, cutting off her path. "Clara, stop!" he shouted. She reined in her mare, causing the animal to dance sideways. "Stay away from me!" she screamed. Her voice was raw, tearing at her throat. "You killed him! You killed him in cold blood!" "He was going to kill me," Luke said, bringing his horse alongside hers. "He was a bounty hunter. Clara, he would not have stopped." "He called you Travers," Clara said. She was shaking so hard she could barely hold the reins. "He said you were a regulator. He said, you." She trailed off, her mind racing, connecting the dots that had been scattered in front of her for weeks. The scars, the nightmares, the knowledge of the land wars, the vague half-truths about Thomas. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Who are you really?" Luke looked at her. The wind whipped his coat around him. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the sagebrush. There was nowhere left to hide. "My name is Luke Travers," he said. "I was a regulator for the Santa Fe ring. I've been running for 5 years. "And the killing?" Clara asked. "The one he mentioned? The one you are wanted for?" "It wasn't a sheriff," Luke said. His voice was hollow, empty of all hope. "That was a lie the hunter told to draw me out. The warrant is for a murder during the ambush at Doña Ana." "Doña Ana!" The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Doña Ana was where Thomas had died. "You were there," she whispered. "Yes." "You knew Thomas?" "Yes." Clara stared at him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The man she had let into her home. The man she had almost let into her bed. The man whose hands had gentled her horses and brushed her hair. He had been there. He had been part of the violence that had made her a widow. Did you kill him? The question was about a knife. Luke looked at her. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the plea for him to deny it. He could tell her he just saw it happen. He could tell her it was someone else. She would believe him because she wanted to believe him. But he was done with lies. The weight of them was crushing him. I cannot tell you what happened that day, Clara, he said. Not yet, but I am the reason he is dead. It was not a confession of murder, but it was an admission of guilt so profound it amounted to the same thing. Clara let out a sound of pure anguish. She raised her riding crop and lashed out, striking him across the chest. "Get out!" she screamed. "Get off my land! Go!" Luke did not flinch from the blow. He took it, accepting it as his due. "I will go," he said. He reached into his pocket. His hand came out holding something small and silver. He leaned over and dropped it into her saddlebag. "What is this?" she cried, backing her horse away. "The truth," Luke said, "or part of it. Goodbye, Clara." He turned the bay horse and rode south, toward the Badlands. Without looking back, Clara rode back to the ranch in a daze. The wind had picked up, turning into a full-blown gale. The sky was a sickly yellow-brown as a sandstorm rolled in from the west, blotting out the sun. She stabled the mare mechanically, her hands numb. She walked into the house, the wind screaming around the eaves like a banshee. She lit a lamp, though it was only late afternoon. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the object Luke had left. It was a piece of silver, roughly triangular, with jagged edges where it had been snapped or broken. It was engraved with scrollwork, delicate and expensive. Clara stared at it. Her breath hitched in her throat. She knew this pattern. She ran to the bedroom, falling to her knees beside the heavy oak wardrobe. She shoved it aside, grunting with the effort, revealing the loose floorboard beneath. She pried it up with her fingernails, ignoring the splinter that pierced her skin. Beneath the floorboard was a small tin box. It contained the few things Thomas had left behind: his pocket watch, a stack of worthless mining deeds, and a silver pendant he had worn for luck. When they had brought his body back, the pendant had been broken. Half of it was missing. The undertaker had given her the remaining piece, still on its chain. Clara opened the box. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the tin. She lifted out the chain. The silver fragment dangled from it, jagged and incomplete. She placed the piece Luke had given her on the table. She lowered the pendant next to it. They fit together perfectly. The scrollwork aligned. The break was seamless. Clara gasped, backing away from the table as if the silver burned. He hadn't just known Thomas. He hadn't just been there. He had been close enough to take this from his body. Or the pendant had been broken in a struggle. I am the reason he is dead. The wind slammed against the house, shaking the walls. Dust began to sift through the cracks in the window frames, coating the table, coating the silver. Clara grabbed the pieces of the pendant, clutching them in her fist until the metal dug into her palm. She ran out of the house, into the barn, needing the smell of the horses, needing to breathe air that didn't smell of Thomas's ghost. She collapsed in the center of the aisle, sinking to her knees in the dirt. The barn groaned under the assault of the storm. The sand hissed against the wood. Luke was gone. He was a killer. He was a monster who had lied to her face, who had touched her with hands stained by her husband's blood. And yet, as she curled into a ball on the floor, sobbing into the silence, the most terrifying truth of all washed over her. She clutched the silver to her chest, weeping not because he was a killer, but because even now, knowing what he was, knowing what he had done, she wanted him to come back. The sandstorm raged outside, burying the world in dust. But it could not bury the truth that was breaking Clara Monroe's heart. The high country was a place where a man could vanish if he had a mind to, and Luke Travers had the mind to vanish. He had made camp in a jagged fissure of granite overlooking the valley, 3 miles up from the Monroe homestead. It was a cold camp, no fire to give away his position. Just a bedroll spread on the hard stone and a strip of dried venison for supper that tasted like leather and salt. For 2 days, he had watched the ranch through the brass scope of his Winchester. He watched Clara come out in the gray light of dawn to feed the chickens. He watched her struggle with the heavy barn doors, her movements stiff, likely from the bruising she had taken at the windmill. He saw her pause, sometimes for minutes at a time, looking south toward the Badlands where he had ridden. He should have kept riding. That was the smart play. That was the survival instinct that had kept him breathing when better men were rotting in shallow graves from Texas to Montana. The border was a week's hard ride away. Mexico offered cheap tequila and anonymity. He could disappear into the Sierra Madre and never think about the Wyoming territory again. But he could not leave. The silver pendant in her saddlebag was a confession, but it was not an absolution. He felt tethered to that dying ranch in the valley, bound by a cord of guilt so thick it felt like a noose. He had told her part of the truth, but the rest of it, the specific, bloody reality of the moment Thomas Monroe died, sat heavy in his gut. He adjusted the focus on the scope. A cloud of dust was rising from the road leading out of Bitter Creek. Riders. Luke stiffened. He counted them as they emerged from the heat haze. 4 men. One rode in front of a prancing white stallion that looked too clean for this country. The other 3 rode slightly behind, sitting their saddles with the loose, heavy posture of hired guns. Luke lowered the rifle. He knew that formation. It was not a social call. He scrambled down from the rocks to where the bay gelding was tied in a stand of scrub oak. He checked the cinch, checked his revolver, and waited. He would not ride down yet. He would watch. If they were just passing through, he would let them pass. But looking at the way the lead rider sat his horse, arrogant, entitled, like a lord surveying his serfs, Luke knew they were not passing through. Clara Monroe saw the dust cloud too. She was in the garden, trying to salvage a row of beans that the windstorm had nearly stripped bare. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and shaded her eyes. When she recognized the white horse, a cold stone formed in her stomach. Sheriff Marcus Hardin. He had been the law in the county for 10 years, and in that time, he had acquired 3 ranches, a silent partnership in the silver mine, and a reputation for solving problems by making them disappear. He was a handsome man in a sleek, predatory way, with a mustache that was always waxed and boots that cost more than Clara's entire herd. He was also the man who had come to her 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, placing a hand on her shoulder that lingered too long, and offering to take the burden of the ranch off her hands, and offering her a place in his own house as a companion. Clara walked to the porch. She did not go inside to hide. She checked that the knife was in her belt, hidden by the folds of her skirt. And she waited. The riders pulled up in the yard. The 3 deputies, men Clara recognized as low-level thugs Hardin had deputized to do his dirty work, fanned out, blocking the exits. Hardin rode his white stallion right up to the porch steps. "Afternoon, Clara," Hardin said. He touched the brim of his beige Stetson. His voice was smooth, like oil poured over gravel. "You are looking weary. The ranch is proving too much for you, just like I said it would." "The ranch is fine, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice steady. "State your business. I have work to do." Hardin chuckled, swinging down from the saddle. He dusted off his pristine trousers. "Always so prickly. It is an unseemly trait in a woman. Clara, a woman should be soft, welcome." He walked up the steps. Clara did not back down, though every instinct screamed at her to run. He stopped 1 step below her, so their eyes were level. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars. "I came to make you one final offer," Hardin said. The smile did not reach his eyes. They were flat and dead, like a shark's. "The bank is calling in the note on this place next month. I own the bank now." "Clara, did you know that? Bought the controlling share last week?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That is not possible." "Anything is possible when you have capital," Hardin said. "I am willing to forgive the debt, all of it. I will take the deed to the land, of course. The water rights are valuable to the railroad. But I am a generous man. I will set you up in a house in town, a nice house. You won't have to work. You will just have to be appreciative." His meaning was crude and unmistakable. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing against her arm. Clara slapped his hand away. "Get off my porch." The silence that followed was absolute. The three deputies shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their guns. Hardin's smile vanished. His face became a mask of cold fury. "You are making a mistake. Clara, you are alone out here, miles from anyone who cares. Accidents happen on these isolated homesteads. Barns burn down, wells get poisoned, women disappear." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It is a statement of fact." Hardin leaned in close. "You have until tomorrow morning to pack your things and bring me the deed. If you are not gone by noon, I will come back. And I won't be asking nicely." He turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted up, gathered his reins, and looked back at her. "Think about it, Clara. You are fighting a war you have already lost." He spurred his horse, and the four men thundered out of the yard, leaving Clara standing on the porch, shaking with a mixture of rage and terrifying helplessness. Luke watched them leave through the scope. He saw the way Hardin had leaned into her space. He saw the way the deputies had circled the house, their eyes scanning the windows in the barn, looking for weaknesses. They were casing the property. He lowered the rifle. He sat on the rock, listening to the wind hiss through the scrub brush. He could leave. He could ride down the backside of the ridge and be in Colorado in 2 days. Clara Monroe was not his responsibility. She was the widow of a man he had killed. She had struck him and ordered him off her land, but he remembered the feel of her breath on his neck when he carried her. He remembered the raw honesty in her voice when she said she needed him. "Damn it," Luke whispered. He stood up and walked to his horse. He did not mount up. Instead, he led the bay deeper into the draw, tying him securely where he would not be seen. He stripped off his saddlebags and cached them under a rock. He checked his weapons, the Winchester, the Peacemaker, and the heavy Bowie knife on his belt. He began to make his way down the mountain on foot, moving from cover to cover, a shadow slipping through the shadows. He would not go to the house. Not yet. He would wait in the perimeter. Hardin had said tomorrow noon. But Luke knew men like Hardin. They didn't wait. They liked to soften up their targets first. They liked to strike when the fear was fresh and the night was dark. Night fell over the valley like a shroud. The wind died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence. Clara barred the doors of the house. She checked the shutters. She sat in the rocking chair by the cold fireplace, the Colt Navy revolver in her lap. She did not light a lamp. That would only make her a target. She was terrified. Hardin's threat had been explicit. He owned the law, he owned the bank, and he had men who would do anything for a paycheck. She was one woman against a corrupt empire. Around midnight, she heard a sound. It was not the house. It was outside. A dull thud, like a boot hitting wood. It came from the direction of the barn. The horses, if they spooked the herd or set fire to the barn, she would lose everything. The animals were her only remaining asset. Clara stood up. Her hands were sweating on the grip of the pistol. She knew it was foolish to go out there. She knew it was likely a trap, but panic overrides logic. And the thought of the horses screaming in a fire propelled her forward. She unbolted the back door quietly. She slipped out into the yard. The moon was hidden behind a bank of clouds. The barn loomed ahead, a dark monolith against the sky. She moved quickly, keeping low. She reached the side door of the barn, the one Luke had fixed just last week. It was ajar. Clara pushed it open with the barrel of her gun and stepped inside. "Who is there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The barn was pitch black. The horses were restless, shifting in their stalls, snorting in fear. Suddenly, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. Clara tried to scream, but the sound was smothered. An arm like an iron bar slammed across her chest, pinning her arms to her sides. The revolver was wrenched from her hand and clattered into the straw. "Gotcha, you little wildcat," a voice growled in her ear. It smelled of stale tobacco and sweat. "One of the deputies. Clara kicked backward, driving her heel into the man's shin. He cursed and loosened his grip just enough for her to twist around. She clawed at his face, her nails raking across his cheek. "You bitch!" the man shouted. He backhanded her. The force of the blow sent her sprawling into the dirt. He loomed over her, a dark shape drawing a knife. "Sheriff said not to kill you, but he didn't say I couldn't cut you up a little first. Teach you some manners." Clara scrambled backward, crab walking through the straw, searching for her gun. Her hand closed in the empty air. The man lunged. Bang! A muzzle flash lit up the hayloft above. The sound of the rifle shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The deputy jerked upright, a look of utter surprise on his face. He dropped the knife and collapsed forward, face down in the dirt, a dark hole in the center of his back. Clara gasped, looking up. Luke Travers dropped from the loft, landing in a crouch. He held the Winchester in one hand, the barrel smoking. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, moving toward her. "Behind you!" Clara screamed. A second man stepped out from the shadows of the tack room, a shotgun raised. Luke spun, dropping the rifle and reaching for his pistol, but he was too slow. Boom! The shotgun blast tore through the air. Luke's body twisted violently as the buckshot caught him in the left shoulder. He grunted, a wet, guttural sound, and went down on one knee. But he did not stop, even as he fell. His right hand brought the peacemaker up. He fired twice, rapid, controlled shots. The man with the shotgun staggered back, dropping his weapon, clutching his throat as he fell backward into a stack of grain sacks. Silence returned to the barn, broken only by the terrified whinnying of the horses and the heavy, ragged breathing of the two living people. Luke stayed on one knee, his head bowed, his right hand still holding the gun pointed at the shadows. Blood was already soaking through the canvas of his coat, dark and slick. "Luke," Clara whispered. She crawled toward him. He looked up. His face was gray, his teeth gritted in agony. "Get the door," he rasped. "Bar it, now!" Getting him into the house was a nightmare. He was heavy, dead weight leaning on her as his strength drained away with the blood. Clara practically dragged him through the kitchen door, locking it behind them. She helped him to the settee, where he collapsed, his breath coming in shallow, hitching gasps. "I need whiskey," Luke mumbled, "and a knife." "Be quiet," Clara commanded. Her fear was gone, replaced by a cold, singular focus. She was a rancher's wife. She had seen injuries before. She lit the lamps. She tore his coat open, flinching at the ruin of his shoulder. The buckshot had torn through the muscle, but by some miracle, it seemed to have missed the bone and the lung. It was a mess of shredded flesh and cloth, bleeding sluggishly. She ran to the cupboard, grabbing the bottle of rye and a clean towel. She fetched her sewing kit and a small paring knife, which she held in the flame of the lamp until the blade glowed dull red. "This is going to hurt," she said. Luke looked at her. His eyes were glassy, pupils blown wide. "I deserve it." She poured the alcohol directly into the wound. Luke's back arched off the settee, a strangled cry tearing from his throat. He slammed his fist into the cushions, his knuckles turning white. "Hold still," Clara said, her voice shaking only slightly. She worked for an hour. She dug out the lead pellets, cleaned the ragged edges of the wound, and stitched the flesh back together with a silk thread. Her hands were covered in his blood. The smell of copper and singed meat filled the small room. When she was done, she bandaged the shoulder tightly with strips of linen. Luke had passed out halfway through, but he woke as she was tying off the final knot. He lay there, pale and sweating, staring up at the ceiling. Clara sat on the floor beside him, wiping her bloody hands on her apron. "They are gone," Luke whispered. "The shots would have scared off any others." "Why did you come back?" Clara asked. She did not look at him. She looked at the fire dying in the grate. "I told you to leave. I couldn't." "Why?" Luke turned his head slowly to look at her. The pain had stripped away every defense he had left. He looked raw, open, and utterly defeated. Because I owe you a life, he said. Clara went still. What does that mean? The ambush, Luke said. His voice was stronger now, driven by the need to purge the poison that had been festering in him for 5 years. It was in a canyon south of Doña Ana. We were tracking a group of cattle buyers who were rumored to be carrying gold. My boss, the man who ran the ring, said they were thieves. He said they had stolen the herd. He swallowed hard. We set up on the ridge. I was the sharpshooter. My job was to take out the leader so the others would surrender. Clara felt a cold chill spread through her limbs. She knew what was coming. The sun was in my eyes. Luke continued, the words tumbling out. The dust was thick. I saw a man on a bay horse. He was shouting, waving his hat. I thought he was signaling an attack. I didn't know who he was. I lined up the sights. He closed his eyes. A tear leaked out, tracking through the grime on his face. I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit him in the chest. He fell. And when we rode down, there were no guns, no gold, just cattlemen driving a herd they had bought legally. The man I shot, he was still alive. Barely. I knelt beside him. He was trying to say a name. Clara. He was holding that pendant. He tried to give it to me, maybe thinking I would take it to you, but he died, and his hand clamped shut, and the silver snapped. Luke opened his eyes. They were pools of anguish. I didn't mean to kill him. Clara, it was a mistake, a goddamned, bloody mistake. But it was my finger on the trigger. It was my bullet. The room was silent. The fire popped. Clara sat there, frozen. The confession hung in the air, hideous and undeniable. He had killed Thomas. Not in a fair fight, not in self-defense. He had shot him from a ridge like a coward, based on a lie. She stood up slowly. She walked to the mantel where she had placed the Colt Navy. She picked it up. The metal was heavy and cold. She turned and pointed the gun at Luke's chest. Luke did not move. He did not flinch. He looked at the barrel of the gun, then up at her face. Do it, he whispered. Make it right. Clara's hand shook. She stared at him. The man who had saved her life tonight. The man who had held her when she was hurt. The man who had killed her husband. She thought of Thomas. She thought of his coldness, his gambling, the way he had treated her like property. She thought of the relief she had felt at his funeral. Did she want Luke dead for killing Thomas? Or did she want him dead because he had made her love him? And that love felt like a betrayal of everything she was supposed to be. She cocked the hammer. The click was loud in the quiet room. Luke closed his eyes, waiting for the end. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. She wanted to fire. She wanted to burn the pain away with powder and lead, but she couldn't. With a sob of frustration, she lowered the gun. She uncocked it and slammed it back onto the mantel. I cannot, she whispered. God help me, I cannot. She turned back to him, her face a mask of tragedy. You will leave in the morning. As soon as you can ride, you will go, and you will never come back. I will, Luke said softly. Clara blew out the lamps, plunging the room into darkness. She did not go to her bedroom. She sat in the rocking chair, wrapping a shawl around herself, and stared into the dark. Luke lay on the settee, breathing shallowly. The pain in his shoulder nothing compared to the ache in his soul. They stayed like that for hours. The wind outside howled, a lonely, desolate sound. Around 4 a.m, the temperature dropped. The house was freezing. Clara shivered violently. She looked at the shape of Luke on the settee. He was shivering too, the blood loss making him vulnerable to the cold. She stood up. She walked over to the settee. Luke tensed as she approached, perhaps expecting the gun again. Clara did not speak. She lifted the edge of the heavy wool blanket covering him. She hesitated for a heartbeat, suspended between her grief and her need. Then she climbed in beside him. It was a narrow space. She had to press her body against his uninjured side. She wrapped her arm across his chest, careful of the bandages. Her head rested on his good shoulder. Luke went rigid with shock. Clara, shut up, she whispered. Her voice was thick with tears. She pressed her face into the hollow of his neck, inhaling the scent of him. Blood, sweat, and the man beneath it all. She felt his heart beating against her hand. It was a strong, steady rhythm. "You ruined everything," she whispered into the dark. "You killed him. You lied to me. You brought this war to my door." Luke's arm came around her tentatively, holding her as if she were made of glass. He buried his face in her hair. "I know. I hate you for it," she said, her voice breaking. "I hate you. I know." Clara tightened her grip, clinging to him as if he were a raft in a stormy sea. She closed her eyes, letting the tears finally fall, soaking into his shirt. "You ruined everything," she sobbed softly. "And I still need you." Luke held her tighter, pulling her as close as physically possible. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply offered his warmth to the woman who should have killed him. As the first gray light of a cold, unforgiving dawn began to creep through the windows, the sun did not rise so much as it bled into the sky, staining the horizon a bruised purple that matched the ache in Luke Travers' shoulder. He stood on the porch of the Monroe ranch house, watching the light catch the dust motes dancing in the cold morning air. His left arm was bound tight against his chest in a sling Clara had fashioned from a flour sack, but his right hand rested on the butt of his peacemaker with a familiarity that frightened him. He had not left, by all rights. He should be halfway to the Colorado border, putting miles of badlands between himself and the woman who had held a gun to his heart. But when the sun broke the crest of the hills, finding him still sitting in the rocking chair with Clara asleep against his good shoulder, the decision had been made. It was not a rational choice. It was the choice of a man who had spent 5 years running from his own shadow and had finally found a light bright enough to banish it. Clara stepped out onto the porch behind him. She wore one of Thomas's old work shirts, cinched at the waist with a belt, and her hair was braided back severely. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with red, but the fragility of the night before had hardened into something sharp and dangerous. "They will be back," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Luke replied. "Hardin is not a man who takes a loss well. He will hire more men. He will come with rifles and fire. Then we need to be ready." "Clara," Luke turned to her, the movement pulling at his stitches. "You can still ride out. Go to Cheyenne. Go to the Marshal." "The Marshal is on a 3-day ride," Clara said, walking to the rail and looking out at her land. "By the time I got back, this house would be ash and you would be dead. I am not leaving my home, Luke, and I am not leaving you." She turned to face him, her chin lifted in a defiance that made his chest ache. "So do not ask me again." Luke looked at her for a long moment. He saw the fear behind her eyes, but he saw the steel too. She was no longer the widow waiting to be rescued. She was a partner in a war she barely understood but was willing to fight. "All right," Luke said. "If we stay, we fortify, and you need to learn how to use that pistol for more than just scaring off coyotes." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation and pain. They boarded up the ground floor windows with planks torn from the old wagon shed. They filled grain sacks with dirt and stacked them on the porch to create waist-high breastworks. They moved the horses into the corral closest to the house, where they could be watched, and filled every bucket and trough with water in case the windmill was cut off. And they practiced. Behind the barn, in a draw shielded from the road, Luke set up tin cans on fence posts. "It is not about aiming," Luke said. His voice grit gravel low. He stood behind her, his chest pressed against her back, his good hand guiding her right arm as she held the heavy Colt. "It is about extension. The gun is part of your hand. You do not look at the sights. You look at the target, and you let your hand do what your eye tells it." Clara's arm trembled under the weight of the weapon. The smell of him, sweat, tobacco, and the faint, metallic tang of dried blood enveloped her. "My hand shakes," she whispered. "Breathe," Luke murmured, his mouth close to her ear. "In through the nose. Hold it. Squeeze the trigger on the pause. Do not pull it. Squeeze it like you are wringing out a wet cloth." Clara inhaled. She felt the heat of his body seeping into hers, grounding her. She focused on the rusted can 20 paces away. She held her breath. She squeezed. Crack! The gun bucked in her hand, sending a shockwave up her shoulder. Dust kicked up 3 feet to the left of the can. Again, Luke said. He did not step away. You are anticipating the recoil. Relax your wrist. They spent hours there, burning through precious ammunition. The sun beat down on them, hot and relentless. Clara's ears rang, and her palm was bruised. But she did not stop. By the second afternoon, she could hit the can 3 times out of 6. But the training was about more than survival. It was an intimacy sharper than any touch they had shared before. With every shot, every correction, every moment his hand covered hers to adjust her grip, the tension between them wound tighter. It was a coil of fear and desire, twisted together until they could not tell where one ended and the other began. On the 3rd evening, the heat broke with a sudden, violent wind that rattled the barn doors. They were in the loft, throwing down hay for the horses. Luke was working one-handed, sweating through his shirt, his face pale from exertion. "Let me do it," Clara said, reaching for the pitchfork. "You will tear your stitches." "I am fine," Luke grunted, stabbing the fork into a bale. He lifted it, but the weight shifted, and he hissed in pain, dropping the bale. He stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. Clara was there in an instant. She grabbed his arm, steadying him. "I told you to stop. Do you want to bleed to death before Hardin even gets here?" "I need to be useful," Luke shouted, the frustration exploding out of him. He glared at her, his eyes wild. "I cannot just sit there and watch you work while I wait for the men I brought down on you to come and finish the job." "You did not bring them," Clara shouted back, shoving him. "Hardin was coming for me anyway. You just gave me a fighting chance. I gave you a death sentence." Luke grabbed her wrists, pulling her close. The air in the loft was thick with dust and the smell of the coming storm. "Look at me, Clara. I am a killer. I killed your husband. I have killed a dozen men since. I am not a savior. I am the thing that ruins people." "Then ruin me," Clara said. Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper. She did not pull away. She stepped closer, until their bodies were touching from chest to knee. "Thomas is dead. The past is dead. We are here, Luke. We are alive. And I'm tired of being a ghost in my own life." Luke looked at her, stunned by the ferocity in her eyes. He saw the hunger there, not just for survival, but for him, for the man beneath the scars and the guilt. Something inside him snapped. The restraint he had held on to since the night of the storm, the wall he had built out of honor and shame, crumbled into dust. He crushed his mouth to hers. It was not a gentle kiss, it was a collision. It was an act of desperate, starving need. Clara made a sound low in her throat and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down. Her hands tangled in his hair, gripping tight. Luke groaned, backing her up until she hit the stack of hay bales. He lifted her, his good arm wrapping under her thighs, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him harder against her. They fell back onto the hay, a tangle of limbs and urgency. There was no time for slow undressing. Luke's hand tore at the buttons of her bodice, popping them loose. Clara shoved his shirt off his shoulder, heedless of the bandages, needing to feel his skin against hers. "Clara!" He gasped against her neck, his breath ragged and hot. "Clara, don't talk," she commanded. She bit his shoulder, right over the scar of an old knife wound, hard enough to leave a mark. "Just be here. Be with me." The act was fierce, driven by the knowledge that death was waiting just down the road. It was sweat and friction, the scratch of hay on naked skin, the taste of salt and dust. It was a reclaiming. Clara took him into herself not as a widow taking a lover, but as a woman claiming her life back from the void. Luke moved with a desperate rhythm, burying himself in her warmth, trying to lose himself in the only good thing he had ever known. He murmured apologies between kisses, words that made no sense and all the sense in the world. "I'm sorry, I love you, I'm sorry." When it was over, they lay tangled together in the straw, their breathing slowing in the quiet of the barn. The wind whistled through the cracks in the siding. Clara lay with her head on Luke's chest, listening to his heart slow its frantic galloping. She traced the line of the new bandage on his shoulder. "I hated him," she whispered. Luke went still. He did not ask who. "Thomas," Clara continued, her voice steady but hollow. "He was cruel. Luke, he was small and mean, and he made me feel like I was nothing more than a broodmare that refused to foal. When he rode out that last time, I stood on the porch and I prayed he wouldn't come back." She looked up at Luke, her eyes dry and clear. "I didn't want him murdered. I didn't want blood on anyone's hands. But I wanted to be free, and when they brought him back in that box, God help me, I was glad." Luke stroked her hair, his hand large and rough against the silk of it. "That doesn't make you evil, Clara. It makes you human." "Does it?" She rested her chin on his chest. "You killed him by mistake. But in my heart, I killed him 1,000 times on purpose. Maybe we are both damned." "If we are," Luke said, pulling her closer, "then we will burn together." "I wished I had never taken that job," Luke said after a long silence. "I was young. I thought the association was the law. I thought I was bringing order to the territory. I didn't know I was just a hired gun for rich men who wanted to steal everything not nailed down. You are not that man anymore." Clara said. "I don't know," Luke said. He looked up at the rafters. "I think that man is still in me. That is the man who knows how to kill Hardin's deputies. That is the man who has to save you." The reality of their situation arrived the next morning with Silas Finch's wagon. The peddler did not come up to the house. He stopped at the gate, looking nervous, his mules skittish. Luke walked out to meet him, the Winchester cradled in his arm. Clara stood on the porch, her hand on her pistol. "I cannot stay," Silas said, wiping sweat from his bald head with a dirty handkerchief. "Sheriff has men watching the road. I thought you should know." "Know what, Silas?" Luke asked. "He has brought in hired guns from Cheyenne, 6 of them, hard men, and he is deputizing the drunks at the saloon. He is telling everyone that you are a cold-blooded cop killer. Caleb, he says you murdered the deputy in the barn and held Clara hostage." "That is a lie," Clara shouted from the porch. "I know it is. Widow Monroe," Silas called back sadly. "But fear makes people believe strange things. Half the town thinks you are a victim. The other half thinks you are bewitched. But they are all scared of Hardin. He says he is coming for the land tomorrow. He says he will burn you out if he has to." Silas gathered his reins. "I brought you some coffee and flour. Left it by the post. That is all I can do. Good luck." He whipped the mules and rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Luke walked back to the porch carrying the sack of supplies. He looked at Clara. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. 6 professional gunmen, Luke said quietly. "Plus Hardin and his deputies. That is 12, maybe 15 men." "We have plenty of ammunition," Clara said, though her voice wavered. "Clara," Luke set the sack down. "We cannot hold them off. Not 15. They will flank us. They will set fire to the barn and the house. They will smoke us out like badgers. So what do we do?" Luke looked at the horizon. He looked at the woman who had bitten his shoulder and confessed her darkest sin to him. He knew exactly what he had to do. "We get ready." He lied. "We board up the back door. We soak the roof. We make them pay for every inch." They worked until sunset. When night fell, the exhaustion was a physical weight. They ate a silent dinner of beans and cornbread. "I will take the first watch," Luke said. "You sleep. I will wake you at midnight." Clara hesitated. She looked at him, searching his face. "Promise me you will wake me." "I promise," Luke said. He kissed her forehead. It was a chaste, lingering kiss. "Go to sleep. Clara." She went to the bedroom. She was asleep within minutes, the pistol still in her hand. Luke waited 10 minutes. Then he moved. He did not wake her. He wrote a note on a scrap of paper from Thomas's ledger, using a piece of charcoal from the fire. He placed it on the kitchen table, weighed down by the coffee pot. He walked out to the barn. He saddled the bay quietly. He checked his weapons. He left the Winchester leaning against the porch rail for Clara. He would not need it. He mounted up and rode out, keeping to the grass to muffle the hoofbeats. He did not look back at the house. If he looked back, he would turn around. And if he turned around, Clara would die. Bitter Creek was asleep, but the lights of the saloon were still burning. Luke rode down the main street, the sound of his horse's hooves loud in the quiet night. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office. It was dark, but he knew Hardin would be at the saloon. Holding court with his new mercenaries, Luke dismounted. He tied the bay to the rail. He adjusted his gun belt. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but his mind was clear. Cold. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The conversation died instantly. There were 20 men in the room. 6 of them sat at a poker table in the corner, men with hard eyes and low-slung holsters. The professionals. Hardin stood at the bar, a glass of brandy in his hand. Luke walked to the center of the room. He kept his hands away from his gun. "Travers," Hardin said. He smiled, but his eyes flicked to the men in the corner. "I did not expect you to make it this easy. I thought I would have to burn the widow's house down to get you." "Leave her out of this," Luke said. His voice was steady, carrying to the back of the room. "She didn't know who I was. I forced my way onto the ranch. I killed your deputy." "I know you did," Hardin said. "And you are going to hang for it." "I am here to make a trade," Luke said. "Me for the deed. You want the land? You can have the land. You want me? You have me. But Clara walks away. She keeps the house, or you pay her a fair price for it and let her leave the territory safely." Hardin laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "You are in no position to bargain. Cowboy, you are a wanted man. I can shoot you right here and nobody would blink." "You could," Luke said. "But I will kill you first." The threat hung in the air. Luke's hand hovered near his gun. He was fast. Everyone in the room knew it. Even with 20 guns on him, he would put a bullet in Hardin before he went down. Hardin's smile faltered. He looked at the mercenaries. They looked back, waiting for the signal. "Fine," Hardin said. "A trade. You surrender your weapon, and the widow gets safe passage out of the territory. I will even give her $500 for the trouble." Luke knew he was lying. He saw the deceit in the corner of Hardin's mouth. But he had to play the hand. He had to buy time. "Your word," Luke said. "On my honor as a lawman." Hardin mocked. Luke slowly unbuckled his gun belt. He let it fall to the floor with a heavy thud. He raised his hands. "Smart boy," Hardin said. Then he nodded to the men in the corner. The first blow came from behind, a rifle butt to the kidneys. Luke buckled, gasping. The second blow caught him in the jaw. He went down hard. Then the boots came. They beat him with a detached, professional efficiency. They kicked his ribs until they cracked. They stomped on his bad shoulder until the stitches tore and fresh blood soaked his shirt. Luke curled into a ball, trying to protect his head. But the darkness was closing in fast. "Drag him to the cell," Hardin ordered, his voice sounding far away. "Doc says he needs to be alive for the hanging. I want the town to see justice done tomorrow at noon." Luke was dragged across the rough floorboards, leaving a streak of red behind him. As they threw him into the iron cage at the back of the sheriff's office, his last conscious thought was not of pain, but of the smell of hay and Clara's hair. Clara woke up with a start. The sun was just beginning to gray the window. "Luke?" Silence. She threw off the covers and ran to the kitchen. The note was on the table. "Clara, he wants me, not you. I am going to end this. Keep the land. Do not come for me. L." Clara stared at the paper. She did not scream. She did not cry. A cold, terrifying calm settled over her. "You fool," she whispered. "You noble, stupid fool." She dressed in 3 minutes. She put on her riding skirt, her boots, and her heavy coat. She braided her hair tight. She walked to the mantel and took down the Colt Navy. She checked the load. 6 shots. She went to the box under the floorboards and took out the rest of the ammunition. She filled her pockets. She walked out to the porch and picked up the Winchester Luke had left. She slung it over her shoulder. She went to the barn. The bay was gone. She saddled the mare, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She mounted up. She did not look at the garden. She did not look at the empty horizon. She looked toward Bitter Creek. The town was waking up to the prospect of a hanging. A crowd had already begun to gather near the gallows that stood behind the sheriff's office. Clara rode down the main street at a gallop. She did not slow down. People scattered out of her way. She reined in hard in front of the sheriff's office. A deputy, a young man named Miller, barely 20, was sitting on the porch, whittling a stick. He had a shotgun leaning against the wall. Before Miller could reach for the weapon, Clara had the Winchester leveled at his chest. "Do not move," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning air like a whip crack. Miller froze. "Mrs. Monroe, now. You don't want to do that. Get up," Clara commanded. "Slowly." Miller stood up, hands raised. "Walk," Clara said, guiding her horse with her knees, keeping the rifle trained on him. "To the gallows." By now, the commotion had drawn attention. People were pouring out of the saloon and the general store. Hardin emerged from his office, looking fresh and shaved, followed by his hired guns. "Clara!" Hardin shouted, stopping on the steps. "Put that gun down before you hurt yourself." "Where is he?" Clara screamed. She backed Miller into the center of the street, using him as a shield. "Bring him out." He is a criminal. Clara!" Hardin yelled, playing to the crowd. "He confessed. He came here to kill me." "Liar!" Clara's voice rang out, clear and furious. She looked at the townspeople, the blacksmith, the shopkeeper, the women she had known for 5 years who had shunned her. "You all know me," she shouted. "You knew Thomas. You whispered that I was cursed. You let this man—" She pointed the barrel at Hardin. "Threaten me. You let him try to steal my land." The crowd murmured. They looked uncomfortable. "Luke Travers is not a saint," Clara continued, tears streaming down her face now, but her aim never wavered. "He did bad things in a war that rich men started, but he came to me. He worked my land when no one else would help me. He saved my life when Hardin's men attacked me in my own barn 2 nights ago. She is hysterical," Hardin barked. "Grab her. Anyone takes a step and Miller dies." Clara cocked the lever of the rifle. The mechanical clack-clack was terrifyingly loud. Miller whimpered. "Sheriff, don't!" "Hardin wants the water rights for the railroad," Clara yelled. "He tried to buy me. When I refused, he sent men to beat me. Luke Travers surrendered himself to save me. He offered his life for mine. Does that sound like a cold-blooded killer to you? Or does it sound like a better man than any of you standing here watching?" The blacksmith, a burly man named Jed, who had been a friend of Thomas's father, stepped forward. "Is that true? Sheriff, did he surrender?" "He came to assassinate me," Hardin lied, sweat beading on his forehead. "I saw him ride in." The apothecary spoke up from the boardwalk. He had his hands up. "I saw you beat him." "Marcus, he didn't fight back." The mood in the street shifted. It turned from curiosity to something darker, something heavy and judgmental. The townspeople of Bitter Creek had tolerated Hardin's corruption because it was easy, because it was profitable. But seeing a widow alone on a horse, holding a rifle against an army of hired thugs, shamed them to their core. "Bring him out," Jed the blacksmith said. He rested his hand on the heavy hammer hanging from his belt. "This is none of your business." "Jed!" Hardin snarled. "Back off. It is our town," the shopkeeper said. He reached under his apron and pulled out an old Navy revolver. One by one, the men of Bitter Creek began to step off the boardwalks. They were not gunfighters. They were farmers, miners, and merchants. But there were 50 of them. Hardin looked at the crowd. Then he looked at his 6 hired mercenaries. The lead mercenary, a man with a scar across his nose, spat on the ground. "I didn't sign up for a town war. Hardin, I signed up for easy money." He turned his horse and began to ride away. The other 5 followed him. Hardin was left alone with his 2 deputies on the porch. "Unlock the cell," Clara said. Her voice was quiet now, but it carried the weight of a judgment day. Hardin looked at the angry faces surrounding him. He looked at Clara's rifle. He looked at Miller, shivering at gunpoint, with a snarl of pure hatred. Hardin reached into his pocket and threw the keys into the dust. "Get him yourself," he spat. "But you won't keep that land. Clara, I promise you that." "You are done, Marcus," Jed said, stepping onto the porch. "I think it is time you turned in that badge." Clara did not wait to see the rest. She slid down from her horse, her legs trembling so hard she almost fell. She snatched up the keys and ran into the sheriff's office. She ran back to the cells. Luke was lying on the cot in the corner. His face was a mask of purple bruises. One eye was swollen shut. His shirt was torn and soaked with fresh blood. "Luke," Clara sobbed, fumbling with the lock. He stirred. He opened his good eye. He looked at her through the bars, confused, as if he were seeing an angel. "Clara," he rasped through split lips. You shouldn't be here." The lock clicked. The door swung open. Clara rushed in and fell to her knees beside the cot. She gathered him into her arms, careful of his ribs, burying her face in his neck. "I told you," she whispered fiercely, tears dripping onto his battered face. "I told you I needed you." Luke let out a breath that was half groan, half laugh. He lifted his hand, shaking and bloody, and rested it on her hair. "I guess," he whispered, "I am not as good at leaving as I thought." Outside, the sun climbed higher over Bitter Creek, shining on a town that had finally woken up. The iron door of the cell swung open with a groan that seemed to echo in the marrow of Luke Travers' bones. He stumbled out, his arm draped heavy over Clara Monroe's shoulders. The pain in his ribs was a dull, roaring fire, and his left eye was swollen shut. But the sight of Clara, fierce, dusty, and smelling of horsehair and gunpowder, gave him a jolt of adrenaline that cut through the haze. "Lean on me," Clara whispered, her arm tight around his waist. "We are walking out of here." They moved through the sheriff's office, past the overturned chair and the keys lying in the dust. Outside, the noise of the town had shifted from a roar to a tense, murmuring hum. The sunlight hit Luke like a physical blow, blinding him for a moment. They stepped onto the boardwalk. The crowd was still there, a sea of faces, some angry, some ashamed, all waiting for the final act of the drama. Jed the blacksmith stood at the bottom of the steps, his heavy hammer resting on his shoulder, a grim sentinel between the lawman and the mob. Sheriff Marcus Hardin was standing near his horse, his face a mask of crumbling vanity. His hired guns had fled, his deputies were cowed, and his town had turned against him. He looked at Clara, helping the broken man down the steps, and the humiliation was too much for a man whose power was built on fear. "You think this is over?" Hardin screamed, his voice cracking. "You think you can just walk away with a cop killer?" "It is over, Marcus," Jed rumbled. "Step aside." "I am the law." Hardin's hand dropped to his hip. It happened in the space between heartbeats. Hardin did not draw on Luke. He knew Luke was beaten, barely standing. He drew on the source of his shame. He drew on Clara. "No," Jed shouted, stepping forward, but he was too far away. Clara froze, her eyes widening as she saw the barrel of Hardin's Remington swing toward her chest. Luke did not think. He did not calculate. The instinct that had kept him alive through the range wars, the reflex that had cost him his soul in a canyon in New Mexico, took over. He shoved Clara hard, sending her stumbling behind a rain barrel. In the same motion, his right hand, the one not bound in a sling, snatched the Colt Navy from Clara's belt. He fell to his knees, his battered body screaming in protest. But his arm rose with the steadiness of a stone statue. Crack! The single shot rang out, flat and final against the false fronts of the buildings. Hardin jerked backward. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his forehead, right beneath the brim of his beige hat. He stood there for a second, a look of utter surprise on his face, before his knees buckled and he collapsed face first into the dirt of the street he had ruled for 10 years. Smoke drifted from the barrel of the gun in Luke's hand. He stayed on his knees, breathing hard, the world spinning gray at the edges. For a long, terrible moment, there was silence. Then, the spell broke. "He killed the sheriff!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. It was a man's voice, panicked and reactionary. "Murder!" another voice cried. The mood of a mob is a fickle thing, shifting like the wind in a canyon. Moments ago, they had been ashamed of Hardin. Now, seeing a lawman dead in the dirt at the hands of a stranger who had already confessed to killing a deputy, the old fear returned. "String him up," a miner yelled, surging forward. "Grab him before he rides." The crowd pushed forward, a wave of angry bodies. Jed raised his hammer, shouting for order, but he was one man against 50. Luke tried to stand, but his legs refused to hold him. He slumped back against the hitching post, gripping the empty gun. He looked at the approaching faces, distorted by rage. He had expected this. This was how men like him ended. Then, a shadow fell over him. Clara stepped between him and the mob. She did not have a gun. Luke was holding it. She stood with her hands empty, her chin lifted, her body a shield for the man on the ground. "Stop!" she screamed. The sheer force of her voice halted the front rank of men. "Get aside, Clara," the shopkeeper said, looking nervous. "He is a killer. Justice has to be done." "Justice?" Clara laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Where was your justice when Hardin tried to steal my land? Where was your justice when he threatened to burn me out? Where was your justice when my husband died and you all left me to rot?" She pointed a trembling finger at the body of the sheriff. "That man was going to shoot me. You all saw it. Luke Travers saved my life. Again." She turned her gaze on the crowd, meeting the eyes of the men she had known for years. "He saved me, and now you want to hang him for it? If you want him, you have to go through me, and I swear by the Almighty, I will not move." The miner who had shouted first shuffled his feet. The shopkeeper looked down at his boots. Jed the blacksmith stepped up beside Clara. He rested the head of his sledgehammer on the ground with a dull thud. "The widow is right," he rumbled. "Hardin drew first. It was self-defense. Any man here who says differently has to answer to me." The tension held for another 10 seconds, thick enough to choke on. Then, slowly, it began to dissipate. The anger drained away, replaced by the weary realization that the violence was done. "What do we do with him?" the apothecary asked quietly. "We let him go," Jed said. He reached down and unpinned the tin star from Hardin's vest. He held it up, the metal glinting in the sun. "And we find a sheriff who knows the difference between the law and a land grab." Jed turned and looked at the young deputy, Miller, who was still standing on the porch, pale as a sheet. Jed tossed the badge to him. "For now, you keep the peace. Miller, and you do it right." Jed turned back to Clara. He reached down and effortlessly hoisted Luke to his feet, supporting the injured man's weight. "Go home, Clara," Jed said gently. "Get him out of here." Clara nodded, tears finally spilling over her lashes. She took Luke's weight from the blacksmith, wrapping her arm around his waist. "Thank you, Jed," she whispered. "Don't thank me," the big man grunted. "Just make sure he was worth it." Clara looked at Luke. His face was a ruin, but his blue eyes were open, watching her with a look of profound, exhausted wonder. "He is," she said. The ride back to the ranch was slow. Luke drifted in and out of consciousness, tied to the saddle of the bay horse which Jed had retrieved from the livery. Clara rode beside him, her hand resting on his knee, keeping him grounded. When they crested the final ridge and saw the ranch house standing intact in the valley below, Clara felt a sob tear loose from her chest. It was still there, the barn, the house, the windmill. It was battered, peeling, and lonely, but it was theirs. They spent the next week in a quiet, healing haze. Clara nursed Luke with a fierce dedication. She changed his bandages, fed him broth, and sat by his bedside when the fever spiked in the night. He healed slowly. The physical wounds began to close, knitting themselves into new scars to join the old ones on his back. But the silence in him was different now. It wasn't the silence of a man hiding. It was the silence of a man waiting for the judgment he felt he deserved. On the second Sunday after the shooting, the wind died down. The air was still and heavy with the scent of sage. "Help me up," Luke said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his left arm still in a sling. "You should rest," Clara said from the doorway. "I have rested enough. There is something we need to do." Clara knew what he meant. They walked out to the yard slowly. Luke carried a shovel. Clara carried a wooden crate she had retrieved from under the floorboards. They went to a spot on the rise behind the barn, overlooking the dry creek bed. There was no marker there, but the earth was disturbed where Clara had once buried a coyote she had been forced to shoot. Luke dug a small pit. The earth was hard, resisting the spade, but he worked steadily, sweat beading on his forehead. Clara watched him, her hands clutching the crate. When the hole was deep enough, Luke stepped back. Clara set the crate down. She opened the lid. Inside were the remnants of Thomas Monroe's life, the ledger book where he had recorded his gambling debts, the silk cravat he had worn to church while nursing a hangover, the deck of cards she had found in his coat pocket, and the pendant. Clara took the silver chain in her hand. She looked at the two halves of the jagged metal, one that had come home with his body, and one that Luke had carried for 5 years. She looked at Luke. He was watching the horizon, his jaw set. He was giving her this moment, but he was also waiting for her to hate him again. He was waiting for her to realize that burying the symbol wouldn't bury the act. Clara walked over to the pit. She threw the ledger in first, then the cards, then the cravat. She struck a match on the sole of her boot and dropped it into the hole. The dry paper of the ledger caught instantly. The flames licked up, orange and hungry against the pale dirt. Clara held the pendant over the fire. The silver grew warm in her hand. "I forgave him a long time ago for being weak," Clara said softly, speaking to the fire, or perhaps to the wind. "I just didn't know how to forgive myself for surviving him." She looked at Luke. "And I forgive you, Luke Travers, not because you saved me, but because you told me the truth." She brought the silver to her lips. She kissed the cold metal, a final goodbye to the ghost that had haunted her marriage and her widowhood. Then she dropped it into the fire. It didn't burn, of course. It just sat there among the ashes of the ledger, blackening in the heat, returning to the earth. Luke stepped forward. He took the shovel and began to fill the hole. He covered the fire, smothering the flames with dirt. He covered the silver. He covered the past. When he was done, he leaned on the shovel, breathing hard. Clara walked up to him. She reached out and brushed the dust from his cheek. "It is done," she said. Luke looked at her, and for the first time the shadow behind his eyes seemed to lift. It is done. Change did not come to Bitter Creek like a flood. It came like the seasons, slow and inevitable, with Hardin dead and a new, honest deputy keeping the peace. The grip of fear on the town loosened. The bank, under investigation by federal marshals for Hardin's fraud, paused all foreclosures. 2 weeks after the funeral on the hill, a wagon rolled into the ranch yard. It was Jed the blacksmith, accompanied by the shopkeeper and 3 other men Clara had barely spoken to in years. They didn't say much. Western men rarely did. They just unloaded lumber, nails, and tools. They spent 3 days fixing the barn roof, repairing the corral fences, and shoring up the porch foundation. Clara tried to pay them. Jed just shook his head. Hardin did a lot of damage. "Clara, we let him do it. This is just balancing the ledger." They rebuilt. Luke worked harder than any hired hand Clara had ever seen, even with one good arm. He did the work of 2 men. He fixed the windmill, and when the pump finally drew water, clear and cold from the deep aquifer, he stood under the stream and laughed, a rusty, joyous sound that made Clara's heart ache. The rains came in late September. It was a gentle, soaking rain that turned the dust to mud and then to soil. The brown hills began to fuzz with green. The creek bed, dry for years, began to run with a thin, singing trickle of water. Clara and Luke lived simply. They had no money, but they had the land, and they had the horses. They sold 3 colts in the spring for a fair price. They ate venison, Luke hunted, and vegetables Clara grew. They were not respectable, not by the town standards. They were not married. Luke was a man with a criminal record, though the town chose to ignore it. and Clara was the widow living in sin. But they were honest. They looked people in the eye. They paid their debts. And at night, when the wind howled around the eaves, they held each other with a fierce, protective love that needed no piece of paper to sanctify it. They were haunted. Yes, Luke still woke up sweating sometimes, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Clara still had days where the silence of the house felt oppressive, but they pulled each other back. They were the anchors in each other's storms. One evening in early summer, a year after Luke had first ridden into the yard, the wildflowers bloomed. They exploded across the valley floor in a riot of color. Indian paintbrush, bluebells, and sunflowers. The air smelled sweet, overpowering the scent of dust and cattle. Luke was coming back from the north pasture, the bay horse walking with a loose rein. He saw Clara standing by the corral fence. She was watching the sunset, the light turning the sky into a canvas of gold and violet. She wore a simple calico dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, but the steel was still there in the set of her spine. Luke dismounted and tied the horse. He walked over to her quietly. He stepped up behind her. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Clara didn't startle. She leaned into him, fitting her body against his as if they were two pieces of the same broken pendant, finally fused back together. She rested her hands over his, feeling the calluses and the scars. "The grass is high this year," Luke murmured into her hair. "It is," Clara said. "The herd will be fat by winter." They stood in silence for a long time, watching the sun dip below the jagged line of the mountains. The peace of the valley was absolute, a hard-won prize paid for in blood and truth. "You never told me," Clara said quietly. "What your real name is?" Luke paused. "I told you, Luke Travers." "No." Clara turned in his arms, twisting so she could look up at his face. Her eyes were dancing with a hint of the old fire, a playful challenge that she saved only for him. "Luke Travers is the name on the wanted posters. Caleb Frost was the drifter. But who are you?" Luke looked down at her. He thought about the boy he had been before the wars, before the killing. That boy was gone, but the man standing here, holding this woman, was real. "I am the man who loves you," he said. "That is the only name that matters." Clara smiled. It was a slow, radiant smile that lit up the dusk. She reached up and traced the line of his jaw. "I still think you're a liar," she whispered. Luke smiled back, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "Then lie with me." Clara laughed, a soft sound that mingled with the evening breeze. She stood on her tiptoes, pulled his head down, and pulled him into a kiss. It was a kiss of promise, a kiss of redemption, a kiss that tasted of wildflowers and rain, sealing their story into the soil of the Wyoming Territory, where love, like the sagebrush, grew toughest in the broken places. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and shadows of the American West, exploring how two wounded souls can find healing in the most unlikely of circumstances. I hope Clara and Luke's story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you tuning in from the busy streets of a city? Or perhaps somewhere as quiet and open as Bitter Creek? Please leave a comment below and let me know. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of grit, romance, and the frontier. And finally, I invite you to share your thoughts in English in the comments section. Did Luke deserve redemption? Was Clara right to forgive him? I look forward to reading your perspectives. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.